long, and hopefully everybody should see their name under the video screen is your name, and there should be a microphone there. If you mute yourself by clicking the microphone, it will be red. That will cut down on background noise. We are now recording. This webinar will be recorded, and a link will be sent out afterwards, and will be posted eventually on our YouTube channel. So I see one person, I think Al Levi has his camera on. If you could just turn your camera off. I will turn my camera off. And Gary, I'm going to put myself on mute, and you can then begin.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. Jeffrey, thank you very much for helping to set this up. I understand that my bandwidth may be a little low, so you can't see me, but you can hear me and you can see the slides which form the gist of the presentation. As Jeff said, I've been involved with TMI for a long time. I first met Alan when he was doing his book tour for climbing Jacob's Ladder, then took one of the original online courses, became a board member, was president of TMI for 3 years. But for much longer than that, I've been an attorney, having spent most of my career in that doing litigation or being involved in litigation. And, litigation, I know we're talking about mediation today. Litigation sometimes gets a bad name because it can be time-consuming, it can limit possible outcomes, and yet I would point out that litigation is an improvement over many other forms of dispute resolution, in particular violence. The mafia does not go down to the courthouse and file its complaint against someone. They use different techniques. Mediation has become increasingly used in the workplace and outside of the workplace in other aspects of dispute resolution that formerly would have been limited to the courthouse setting. And I will go through most of those. In addition to what specifically takes place in the workplace, I think it will be obvious as to how this fits in the workplace as well. I will start with background that most of you will know, maybe all of you will know, because you all have background in Mussar. I'm trying to get to my next slide. Good. Okay, so what is Mussar? I have a feeling many of us have different answers to this question. Here's one, an ancient practice from the Jewish tradition that seeks to address the fundamental conflicts of personality and relationships that all people in society face. And the issue of conflicts, I think, is critical here. I think in the next universe, or the multiple universes that perhaps result or that accompany string theory, there wouldn't be conflicts. And if there were no conflicts, maybe there wouldn't be Mussar practices. Maybe there wouldn't be Torah. But I mentioned fundamental conflicts, and what do I mean by that? And we'll go back to the beginning, and there we have one picture of the beginning, rather consistent with both the Big Bang Theory and the biblical version. And we know that in the very beginning, okay, we have the story of creation. Man is created, Adam, and woman is created from Adam, and things go pretty well for a while, for about two chapters, the end of chapter 2 of Genesis. And then we get to chapter 3, and there's this bit about the fruit, and this leads to the first conflict. So here we are. We're getting toward Mussar, we're getting toward mediation very quickly. And what we know is that at some point, Adam ends up eating this fruit, and God is a little concerned and says, where are you guys? And Adam says, I heard your voice in the garden, was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself. And God's a little suspicious and says, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from? And at this point, everybody owns up to being a mature adult and accepts responsibility for what's going on. And Adam says, the woman you put at my side, she ate of the tree and I ate. And somebody has said to me that they think this is the first joke in the Bible, and obviously it depends on how you read it, but certainly one way to read it is with a sense of irony that could be intended. And then we go from Adam to Eve, and the Lord says to her, what is this you have done? And she says, also accepting full responsibility, the serpent beguiled me and I ate. So life goes on after that. Adam and Eve get expelled, and then they start having a family. Eve conceives and bears Cain, saying, I gained a male child with the help of the Lord. And then she has his brother Abel, who becomes a keeper of sheep, while Cain becomes a tiller of the soil. So here we have the first family, the first siblings, and like most parents, like most of us, to the extent they have kids, Adam and Eve take to heart the lessons they've learned from their lives, so their kids won't make the same kind of mistakes that they did. They won't drink or smoke marijuana at a too early an age, and the kids look okay. And in the course of time, Cain brought an offering from the soil, and Abel brings the choice of the firstlings of his flock. And as you can see from the depiction here, these look like good kids. They're grateful. They try to acknowledge their gratitude, and everything looks pretty good. But as we know, things don't always go according to plan. And while the Lord paid heed to Abel and his offering, to Cain and his offering he paid no heed. And Cain, very understandably, was distressed and his face fell. And the Lord, and I think these two verses really are critical to much of what follows in the Torah, much of what follows in life, and forms a certain foundation to the Mussar practice we all have and to our ability to resolve and work through conflicts. So the Lord says to Cain, why are you distressed? Why is your face fallen? Surely if you do right, there is uplift. But if you do not do right, sin couches at the door, its urges toward you, yet you can be its master. Okay, pretty interesting. So Cain thought over what God told him. Sin couches at the door, you can be its master. Lots of possibilities here. And he decided, because he had took Mediation 101, that the best thing to do was to have a talk with Abel so he could figure out what to do with this apparent conflict. Maybe Abel could even figure it out. Obviously, Abel's offering was accepted, Cain's wasn't. Well, maybe a discussion here would flush out what had gone wrong. But that's not exactly what happens. We know Cain speaks to Abel, but we don't know what that conversation was. I guess it didn't go so well, because it came to pass that when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother and killed him. And the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? And Cain says, famously, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? Which people seem to have different answers to. So, there we are. Fundamental dilemma, fundamental conflict. And 5,774 years later, the possibilities for conflict are endless, and we come across them every day in many forms. Now, so what interferes without being able to handle these conflicts? For the most part, we really know what to do. We all pass the pen and paper test when we're given that. So here's the test from what we just saw. Was Adam blaming Eve really in everyone's interest? Yes, no. And then we've got that's the multiple choice part, and then we have a bit of an essay part here. Does that usually work in your life? What were there? Adam and Eve's needs and interests. What got in the way? And should Cain have killed Abel? Yes, no. But we know the answers to these questions. And then we can consider, is there an alternative outcome? What were Cain's needs and interests, and what got in the way of that? So we're in the area of Mussar here, we're in the area of dispute resolution, and we're in the area of what goes on inside and outside of the workplace. And I'm trying to get to the next slide, but not successfully. Let's see. Okay. So, how did we do? Everybody got 100 on the multiple choice section here. Everybody answers. A little essay portion there, that's what would lead to commentary, Mussar, and our journaling practice. But even in that, everyone scores at least a 95 if we take 10 minutes to think it over, because none of this is rocket science. If we were to have a discussion, we'd all come up with good answers pretty quickly, especially when it comes to other people. We'd know what to tell them to do. And in general, we all know that we should be one. Honest, generous, gracious. You can just quickly look through this and realize that every one of these Middot, these traits, are items that we know we should be able to embrace, and we certainly expect everybody to embrace them properly. And that if they did that, their lives and our lives would be better. And again, if we were, somebody I think needs to mute. So if you could, make sure they're muted. And it's good, if we could all be responsible and trusting and logical and loving and diligent and determined, open-minded, all good stuff. So, I guess we need to think this over and figure out what to do. And for most of you on this call, I would suggest that there are two things to keep in mind going forward. Again, we're not in the realm of rocket science. Two things to keep in mind, and this is an essential part of our Mussar practice and study, and it's an essential part of what we should bring to wherever we are in life. And the first is human nature. We all have this Yetzer Hara, Yetzer Hatov, and we live with them. And as we know, the form and the content of each is different for each of us. But we know we have this part of our human nature and part of everyone else's human nature. And it's good for us to be cognizant of that. And consistent, and part of this is one of my favorite things in life, and I think another critical aspect of Mussar is the bell curve. We all fall somewhere under this bell curve, both with our Middot, our talents, our abilities, and everybody else falls under them, the bell curve as well. And it's important to keep in mind that to some extent our goal here is to move to one end of this bell curve than another. Probably most of us fall in the middle for most things, and then there are those other sides that we want to move toward or perhaps even away from. Now I want to go back to God's comment, the importance of which I emphasized earlier, that surely if you do right, there's uplift. But if you don't do right, sin catches at the door, its urges toward you, that you can be its master. Should I have that donut, as Homer is asking himself all the time? We know how he answers that question, or not. So there's a playbook of sorts that Cain was given, but it's really, there are a lot of blank pages there, key details in this thing. So, for example, how do you become the master? How do you become the master of those areas? And I think the slide was supposed to go later, actually. But I would just say this, that people involved in the mediation are dealing with a problem that used to be a concern. This is a line from a mediator on the West Coast, Woody Mostyn. And his point, at the risk of being obvious, is that problems tend not to arise sua sponte at a given moment in time. They tend to develop, and if we go back, we can see where those problems come from. One of the things we want to do is sensitize ourselves to seeing what could become a problem and what's simply a concern. And in the area of mediation, and I tend to do work in the areas of divorce and employment and commercial cases, all different kinds of commercial cases, and personal injury cases. And I had a little caveat here for except for personal injury cases. And that's because if you think of the classic personal injury case, a car accident, there's often not a long background there. There's not often a lot of development that takes place. But in all other aspects of mediations that I've been involved in, there are backgrounds, there are developments. They go back months, years, and typically there were concerns arose that hadn't yet developed into problems. So, we know that Mussar, one critical aspect of Mussar, is to make the heart feel what the mind knows. And if we go back to Cain and Abel and the difference between a pen and paper test and perhaps what we do, we know that our minds are pretty good. Our minds know what the right answers are. The question is, how do we go from that to our heart feeling a certain way so that our actions follow from what our mind knows would be appropriate. And of course, for us, one way is Mussar, and we engage in our Mussar practice by focusing on different traits, and we read and discuss and write. And as I showed before, if we look at the different traits, they're different from the other list. And I'm sure everybody here has a copy of Everyday Holiness, and you've looked at the back and you've seen the appendix that Alan put there, where he lists other traits. And probably all of us have come up with traits that are not listed in the appendix, that are not listed here, that are not listed in the table of contents of any of Alan's books or any of the classic Mussar works. And that's one of the great things about Mussar, is it gives us more and more to work on and to study, finer gradations of things. Now, in dispute resolution, and whether you're doing this as a professional mediator or you're thinking, how am I going to handle this problem with my kids or with employees, people who I supervise, the people who are my bosses, all these come to bear in the dispute resolution process. Either the parties, typically I'm involved in a lawsuit, but it's certainly a dispute. The worst cases I work on are not yet necessarily in the form of lawsuits. Typically they're not. But all the Middot come to bear on the process, either because the parties and their behaviors, both before and during the mediation, or the actions and words that you choose as a mediator, as somebody trying to work through a problem, choose to use, or just as importantly, choose not to do. What do I do? What don't I do? What do I say? What don't I say? And of course, as we know, this can be difficult. We come out with comments and we think, ooh, maybe I shouldn't have said that or done that. Sometimes we think it right away. Sometimes we think it the next day. Sometimes it hits us 10 years later. And as we know, some of us are trying to do, and others, those that show up repeatedly, represent our challenges and our personal soul curriculum, what it is we have to work on. And here's another version of the bell curve. We go from one extreme to the other, and we see somewhere in the middle maybe where we want to fall on any given trait. There's humility. There's patience. And this is a nice slide that Alan did. And we know that the Mussar process involves some kind of what start with sensitization for reading, studying, journaling, etc. And then leads to, I don't know if restraint is necessary, can lead to restraint. It can lead to changes of behavior, which, as we know over time, can lead to thought. And I think once we've hit that level where we're changing how we're thinking about things, we're beginning to engage in some kind of transformation. And this process goes on because no longer do we feel we've transformed a little bit, but then we realize that, wait a second, we've got this part where we come up a little short, or that part, and we go through the whole process again. And this is the wonder of Mussar. It's also the wonder of mediation. And of course, mediation takes place in a much shorter period of time than our own Mussar practices do. And yet, sometimes one can see this happening very quickly during the mediation. Philanthropist once said that people have hidden engravings, and these engravings take place over time, but we don't see them as they happen. And of course, that works both ways. These are the hidden engravings that develop in us as we grow, and then there are the hidden engravings that take place while we engage in Mussar practice. And the process of mediating a dispute often requires us to get the parties behind their hidden engraving. And we want to create new engravings that often are hidden at first, but then actually emerge during the course of mediation. And I think we've probably all this, whether you're somebody who's worked in a professional capacity mediating, and I assume most people here have not, although many of us have no doubt worked on resolving a dispute in one form or another. What we know is as we develop our own abilities to see traits as they emerge, so we don't just realize 10 years later what we could have done differently, and as we learn to address these traits in ourselves and learn to observe them in others, we can be more successful in resolving disputes. Now, one of the things I've always really liked about Mussar Practice is that it's practical. How do I handle the different traits as compared to how other people handle them? And we know the effect goes beyond the practical, but the day-to-day Mussar Practice is really, or at least I find it a very practical one. I need to write, I need to think, I need to do. Aristotle has a similar approach, and we know Aristotle's description of the golden mean and how one achieves that through practice. With regard to ethics, he thinks it has to be practical. It can't be defined with mathematical precision. There's a difference between knowledge and wisdom, and what Cain lacked was wisdom, not knowledge. Because I'm going to assume that Cain, too, would have passed the pen and paper. And what I have found over time, and I think this will be true for most of us, if we think of where we've encountered disputes, that the people we deal with rarely lack knowledge. They may lack some insight, but they don't lack knowledge. And there are a few aha moments during mediation. Instead, changes in attitudes often unfold during the mediation, and this allows the emergence of ideas. And if you think of having an argument with somebody, that doesn't usually allow for the emergence of ideas. I remember Rob said in his mediation how having equanimity and calm is often essential to resolving an issue. And I've always found that to be true in mediation. In mediation, that equanimity and calm comes from the mediator. When you are involved in a dispute or trying to resolve a dispute, among others, your being calm not only gives you the ability to think, it gives you that distance. There's a little modeling that goes on there as well, because as you remain calm, to some extent you can impart some calm to others. And I don't think in general that you resolve the dispute because suddenly a person says, I get it now, I see what you mean, because there's too much involved. There are too many hidden engravings for that change to take place that quickly. Which is why, while some mediations can be successfully done in a day, and this would be true if you think in the workplace, most of the disputes that arise there cannot be resolved in a day. People oftentimes need time to think about things and need to start the etchings of those engravings start to slowly take place without realizing that they're happening. Now, the rest of the discussion here will really engage in practical applications. And to some extent, I'm coming that my description of this will be from the standpoint of the mediator. But again, this is applicable to any kind of conflict or dispute we're involved in. And there's no right or wrong, I shouldn't say that. There can be right or wrong answers here. And I think we've all seen right or wrong answers play out and right and wrong actions. But the Middot come to play in everything, and it's the awareness of them and our attempting not to apply them to ourselves, but get others to apply them as best they can during a dispute. So, with regard to patience, too much the mediator or the party. If you're involved in mediating a dispute, oftentimes parties really need to vent, and you need to be really patient and not cut people off. And of course, there's a great tendency to do that. I think in the workplace, if you're called upon to resolve a dispute, you can hear people go on and on and on, and it can be very tempting to cut them off. You may also want to cut them off because what you see going on is that another person or another side is getting riled up by the comments of one side, and there can be a point of diminishing returns. So you have to consider when it's appropriate to wait, and there can be that tendency also to want to create a solution. And I think one of the things we find in mediation is that mediators rarely create solutions. They create the foundation for solutions that typically come from the parties. So the question arises when to push and when to wait. And anger, as you can see, related to patience, obviously, it's almost always there. Ironically, I do divorce mediations where there's not a lot of anger. There's more sadness than there is anger. There's a certain self-selection involved in people coming to a divorce mediation, especially when there are kids and they're both interested in having things work out for them and for their children. And that they may both be sad. One may be more angry than the other. That's fairly common. And even there, you need to allow that anger to be expressed. Interesting question. When should you address it? Do you always tend to take heat in mediation as reframing? So I hear that you're angry about Y and Z. It's actually very important to do. People want to be validated, and validated doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with the truth of what they're saying, or even that you're acknowledging the truth. You're simply acknowledging that you've heard what they said, and the importance of that acknowledgement is not only that that person has heard what you've said, but the other person, the other side, has heard what the other party has said, but they've heard it through your mouth, which is very different. They tend to be then, the other side tends then to be less reactive. And you can think about that, how that could play out in different disputes that you may be involved in. And this validation, this acknowledging, can be seen pretty trite. Oftentimes, when I do it, I literally repeat the exact same words that somebody has said. So, I hear you say, you're angry at the way Bob asked you to take on certain assignments. And he may have said, I don't like the way Bob asked you to take on certain assignments. And I've never had a situation where someone has said to me, looked at me strangely as if I was somehow just repeating them without there being any point. And of course with anger, you have to be careful. When it boils over, where do you draw the line? If somebody's going to leap over a table and attack somebody, a situation I have not had to deal with, what would you do? Now, obviously, hopefully you're handling things so it doesn't get to that point. But what's critically important is that you go in knowing anger is something that's going to have to be dealt with here. And if there's no anger, you may have to be concerned then as well. If there weren't any anger. So, trust. It's funny, you'll notice there are lots of bullet points here. When I was thinking about trust and mediation, I started coming up with more points. The first is whether it's important for the mediator to develop trust of the parties. You would think that's obvious, but then there are variations on this. Is it possible to create trust between parties? Oftentimes that seems really difficult, but you can find as the mediation proceeds, there is some trust. And in that case, maybe it develops some understanding. Is it necessary? Not always, especially if parties are represented by attorneys. When might it be necessary? It might be necessary toward the end of a mediation when people are getting close to a resolution. And there's that question that will the bubble over the party's head may be, can I really trust that person? And if you've done a good job as a mediator, hopefully you've created some trust between the parties, because they will have been able to say things that the other side will have heard that they will have not heard before. Trust arises in another context. Do the lawyers trust each other even if the parties don't? Well, that can be critical. Maybe the parties don't, but if the lawyers do, then something can be worked out. But the opposite. The clients can trust each other even though the lawyers don't. I've been in situations where the clients, toward the end of the mediation, everybody's tired and worn out, and the clients say, the opposing parties say, can we just talk about this for a few minutes without the lawyers? Everybody says yes, and the parties go into another room and 15 minutes later come back and say, we think we've worked this out. Do the lawyers trust the mediator? I think that's always important. There are numerous occasions when a lawyer will tell me or will ask me, can you help me with my client? And they only ask you that if they think you can. And they'll ask you that in many different contexts. And that can take all sorts of different forms in terms of the lawyer trusting you as a humility, always important. And you can see this. How much space does a party take up? There's somebody who's shirking mediation to the point where other people are getting increasingly frustrated because they're not having a chance to talk. But again, we want to give people time to express themselves. If they're too much, too little, what do you do when you're in that situation? And again, in an employment situation, you can be sitting and watching these things happen where you know they've taken place. You have meetings. What do you do in a meeting when people talk too much? I know nobody's ever been in that kind of meeting, but on the off chance that it's happened, that you've been in meetings and the same people talk too much, is there a way to move on from that? And how do you do it? Do you take someone aside and say it abrupt in some way that doesn't make the person feel bad, but allows the conversation to continue? And when you're doing that, knowing that it's not about you. You're not doing that just because you're frustrated. You're doing that because you're trying to achieve a goal. And if it's a meeting, you want that meeting to proceed, and you want it to be useful and productive, and you don't want to waste people's time. Gratitude. Is it possible to get a party to express gratitude? Oftentimes at the end of a mediation, people do express their gratitude. But what about during a mediation? What about during they're trying to resolve a dispute? I had a divorce mediation once where the husband spent most of his time, a good part of his working time abroad. And their marriage was not working, and he was coming back to the States. And his wife found him an apartment because they really knew they didn't want to live together, and it was better for them, for him to have another space. She found him an apartment. That apartment worked out. And during the mediation, she said, he never even thanked me for finding him an apartment. And I said, Jim, are you grateful that she did that? And he said, yeah, I'm grateful. And I said, well, could you tell her that? Because she said, yeah, I'm grateful to me. And he looked at her and he said, I really appreciate your having found me an apartment. And clearly he meant it. And her stress level went from 100 to 14, just immediately. She breathed out and we moved on. And were able to get a lot more done after that. So that was the effect of that. Typically, I do express gratitude to people at the end of a mediation session, at the end of any successful resolution. Mediations are almost always successful in one form or another, and that's something to keep in mind, I think, in terms of working things out in the workplace. Things come out that wouldn't take place but for the mediation, and those are useful. They may not seem useful immediately, but they are useful later on. Empathy and compassion. Typically, we think of this being helpful in resolving any kind of dispute. When should it be used? Do you want to express it when you're together with people involved in a dispute? You may not want to do that right away because, remember, one side's not going to be compassionate to the other. That's where the reframing, saying, I hear what you say, you're saying X, rather than even saying, oh, I understand why you feel that way. You may want to do that when you're talking separately to someone. you say when you're in a joint session that, oh, I understand how the other party is not going to be very pleased with that, and you may have alienated them to some extent. And of course, there's a situation where you're simply not empathetic toward a party. You don't feel compassion to them. You feel they've acted to be worse than improper. Maybe that's where silence is best. Generosity. Generosity can be used in all sorts of ways. Legal actions typically involve money, not always. So generosity can be giving money, but it doesn't always have to be money. Generosity can take the form of how people talk to one another, of people waiting to talk and giving other people time. Sometimes when you speak to people separately, you can appeal to their generosity. Maybe you don't use the word generous because they feel generous, but in your mind, you know that that's what you're appealing to. There are different kinds of cases. I put down divorce, employment, commercial, personal injury. Personal injury cases, generosity is not typically an issue. In divorce it can be. In employment cases it can be. You may have an former employee. Does the employer want to be generous toward them? Not necessarily, but sometimes the employer does understand the situation of an employee, and their acting generous can be a way to resolve the dispute. I've mentioned silence. Oftentimes there are difficult situations in any ongoing dispute when you're listening to the parties and there's silence. And there's a tendency to want to fill that void. And sometimes, if it goes on too long, you want to fill it. There's a question of what do you want to fill it with. But oftentimes, if you simply say nothing, eventually somebody else does. And what they say there is typically of value. It's the content, it's the form, it's the tone. So one thing to keep in mind always is, when do you speak up? When do you break a silence? And if you're the person mediating, to some extent, parties sometimes need help. And then it may be important to break the silence. But you really want ideas to come from the parties to the dispute, because they usually know things best. Sometimes you're very much involved with them, and you may know what's best for working through a situation. Rob gave some examples of those in his talk. The truth is kind of because the semi-rhetorical question in the first part is not a question. Truth is not necessarily always for the best, and it's not necessarily your role as a mediator to bring out the truth. And when is it important to be truthful to somebody? Is it important to be truthful to somebody and say, listen, I think what you're saying isn't going to work? Would you say it doesn't make sense? You might, if you then are following that up with something that, no, it doesn't make sense because of the following reason. And you'd have to put that in a way that someone else could understand. If you want to sell a resolution, and this is often the case in resolving money disputes, and I often go back and forth and I say, I think I can get X from someone, but I'm not sure. In fact, I know full well I can get more than X, and I think I can get them to give X, but I'm not sure, and I know full well I can get them to give something or more. But that's a technique. So there you're working, and you're working in a way not to create falsehoods per se, but as a means to achieve an outcome that is consistent with truth. Simplicity. Simplicity can often be very important. The caveat is not trying to simplify things too soon. You may listen to a dispute and quickly realize this is about X. It's not the parties, the people to the dispute are talking about X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E, and F. But you can quickly figure out that it's about X. It can be very helpful to ultimately get the people involved in the dispute to realize that and to acknowledge that. And come that point where you say, let me ask you a question. Is this really about X? And oftentimes, people nod their heads and say yes. Interesting question again, do you do this while both parties are in the room, or do you do it when you're speaking to them separately? You may say to one side, for you, is this about X? And to the other side, is this really about Y? But you don't want to reduce things to these people, when they're involved in the dispute, for them it's very complex, and they haven't worked through it to the point where it may exist in a more discrete form. And of course, when you simplify, then solutions become more possible. What may have seemed impossible at first, when simplified, becomes possible. So your goal here in resolving a dispute is consistent with, I think, the goal of Mussar Process, which is wholeness, not necessarily happiness. And I'd say the goal of mediation is not to achieve a perfect resolution, but a resolution that works for the parties and that is better for an alternative or alternatives. It leaves the party with a sense of wholeness. Typically, at the end of a successful mediation, parties are very calm. They're obviously much, much calmer than they were when they came in the room. Divorce mediations, which inevitably take place over time because people need to process information, people often show up very agitated. Sometimes they leave agitated, but oftentimes they leave much more because they've been able to vent and they've been able to process a little bit. And I think that often happens in the workplace as well, where when people are allowed to vent, they then are able to process. And perfection is not the goal in resolving a dispute through mediation, nor the goal in mediation. So I think that's the gist of things. I'll open up to questions now. You're all free to send email questions later. I'd be happy to discuss it. I don't know what everybody's background is who's on. I can't see who's on who's attending right now. But whether you're seeing this live or seeing it as a recording, feel free to contact me and ask any questions that you would like. Jeff, I'm not sure how we go from here.
Right. So if anybody wants to ask a question, the best way to do it is to click the chat box and type in a chat message. You can send it to everybody if you want, or you can send it just to Gary or to me. And if you can't get that to work for some reason, you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
And Jeff, should I close the PowerPoint?
It doesn't. No, you can leave it up. That's fine.
Okay.
So if anybody has any questions, either they want to ask in the chat room or by unmuting themselves, they can do that. A lot of people will be watching this as a recording. The link will go out tomorrow. Looks like somebody has asked a question. Gary, I don't know if you can read that in the chat room.
I do not see anything, sorry. Chat. Let me click on chat here. Maybe I'll see.
Click on chat.
Okay, so someone asked, I don't know if everyone can hear me, I'll assume. Let's see. I very much appreciated your comment that validating does not necessarily mean that you agree with what they're saying, but just that you've heard what they're saying. That's actually difficult to do. Thoughts about that? Yeah, my thoughts are kind of embedded in the comment that I think this is where reframing comes in. That the way you validate is by saying, I hear you say X. And I think, as I said earlier, you can almost use their exact words. I think early on in the mediation, it's actually important to say that when all parties to the dispute are present in the room, because it's often the only way that the other side can hear those comments in a way that doesn't make their blood boil, because you become an intermediary, and people aren't angry at you, they're angry at the other side. So when you say it, it doesn't bring out the same kind of reaction. And also, it allows people to hear things in a way that they weren't before. Another question, what do you do if a supervisor is stressing out the employee? It's a good question because I've seen that happen, and obviously the person who asked the question has seen it happen. Depending on your situation, if you are the above the supervisor employee, you may be able to simply say, well, let's try to push down here a little and see where we can go with this. And maybe there's where you reframe and you don't use the exact words that the supervisor used in terms of, I would say you leave out the first words, but you may say, listen, Jane supervisor, I hear you saying X, and Jim supervisor or Jane supervisor, assuming you reframed it accurately, would probably say, yes, that's exactly it, and I'm pissed that so-and-so and the employee has talked. And if the employee hasn't, it might be a good opportunity to give the employee there a chance to talk, because you don't want an employee to be humiliated, nor do you want a supervisor feeling that they can humiliate an employee or talk to them in any way. I would also say after this, you want to take the supervisor aside if you're in a position to do it and say, you should not be talking to the employees like that. It's not good for you. It's not good for them. It's not good for us. And if you've got problems of that kind, come to me first. But I don't want to see you doing that again. You may have to be very firm about that. A follow-up question is that the employee might be fearful of speaking honestly because of losing a job. I think that's absolutely true if the supervisor is still present, and I would not encourage the employee to say anything that would get them fired. Maybe if you're in a position to speak to the employee separately, they can speak honestly to you. Excuse me. And that in itself can help lead to some kind of resolution. It may not always, but maybe it will help the employee feel better, and that in itself can be very useful. I can think of one particular situation, and this really did have to do with an employee who had been almost humiliated at one point. And they came to me to speak about it, and we were able to work something out so the employee wouldn't be in that situation again. So that was one particular example. Again, everything's different. Every one of these situations will be different. You have to know the people you're working with some way. The way you get to know them better is to speak to them. And as you reframe what they're saying, you'll learn something about them. And oddly enough, just the way when you journal, you learn something about yourself. They'll learn something about themselves. Question, supervisor will know that if there's corruption, has been exposed, there'll be repercussions. Well, that may be true. Maybe that's something that has to be discussed. If people have been involved in corrupt activities, and those corrupt activities are going to be exposed, and people will be fired or people will be prosecuted, one thing you may be to do is tell people to start speaking to lawyers. These are very tight situations, and I know this is not typical, but it certainly does happen. People may often worry at times more about this than they need to as well. Sometimes what appears to be corrupt is not really corruption. People taking a bribe is usually corrupt, but oftentimes they're fall well short of corruption. Sometimes other people interpret people being corrupt, but the interpretations are incorrect. I'm reading another question here. Where the employee has been a whistleblower and the boss is the corrupter, presumably the person who has been corrupt, perhaps no one else wants to whistleblow for fear of losing job. Well, that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. Whistleblower laws exist. They are inconsistently used. I read an article recently about a whistleblower who collected $7 million for blowing the whistle on a company, a medical provider company that was using a device, selling a device for knee transplants. The whistleblower knew there was a problem with these and blew the whistle, was of course immediately fired, ultimately recovered $7 million as a result of a whistleblower statute. But many people don't. Many people are fired. They don't collect millions of dollars. They lose their jobs, and they are really concerned about ever being able to get another job because they know they can't go back to the company that they worked for a good recommendation. As for fear of personal or family harm, that may be real. That may be very real. That's another question that was asked. And that's, again, I think it's important for the person in that situation, the whistleblower, then should be going to speak to a lawyer. You want to go speak to an employment lawyer and find out what your rights are. An employment lawyer will also probably give you, should be able to give you some good advice as to what the consequences will be of doing something or not doing something. I don't see any more questions now. I don't know if there are others.
So this will be the time if anybody has any more questions, either to type them in the chat box or to unmute yourself, since we're getting towards the end of our 60 minutes of time.
People can also feel free to call me. You can get my phone number. So that's a better way to go through something.
Do you want to give them your email? You want to give your email address?
Yeah, people still, in fact, if people still have up the PowerPoint. Yeah, well, my email is Gary, G-A-R-Y. Should I type that in somewhere? Can I?
If it's on your PowerPoint, you can go to that page.
Let me see what the next page is in the PowerPoint. Here you go. Gary at ShafferMediation.com. And the number underneath.
And of course, this will go out by email tomorrow. A link to this webinar, so you can watch it again or share it with friends, people who you think may be interested. We're very happy to have you share that. A couple people said thank you, Gary. You can see those on there. So if nobody has any more questions, we will get ready to sign off. Thank you all for being on our webinar today. You'll get notices of the upcoming webinars, which I'm sure you've already received, but we'll continue to send those out. And I just urge you to sign up for them, even if you can't attend. That way you'll make sure to get the link to the recording. So sign up, and then you'll get the recording, even if you can't be on live. So, Gary, I want to thank you very much for doing this webinar and being with us today.
Well, thanks to you, Jeff, for all your help.
For your experience. And we'll wish everybody a wonderful day and see you for the next webinar.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Everybody can exit as they want to. I'm going to end